Welcome to the quarterfinal round of the Winter Holiday Open 2020. In this round, we have on side proposition WPGA Hemlock. On side opposition, we have Grand Oaks. Fortunate that both teams are in the same hemisphere, body clocks should not be terribly affected by this round. The teams will be debating the motion, "This house prefers a world where children are raised communally." This house prefers a world where children are raised communally. There was an info slide given. Before we begin, a few things. I will do my best to keep up with the 1 minute and 7 minute protected clap. If I forget that, it is on the debaters to have timing themselves. You should be timing everyone anyway in case there is a technical issue. If there is a technical issue during the round, please try to rejoin as quickly as possible. If the other team members will do frantic waving or something so that we can stop and pause our timers and to allow that person to rejoin. So hopefully you have a plan B for that type of situation. At the end of the round, the judges will disappear, make our decision, return, give the brief RFD for the round, etc. Are there any questions before we start? All right, then I will ask each speaker to please inform the other team how they would like points of information to be given. Please indicate, for example, you would like them non-verbally with a hand or a little sign or a verbal interruption. Okay, then, with that in mind, excited to have this quarterfinal round. We will begin with the opening speech for side government. Hear, hear.
Hi, sorry, you guys can just offer POIs verbally because I don't really look at Zoom. I'm just gonna get my timer set up, but that's okay with you guys. Okay, my time starts on my first word. When there are benefits to parents because we fulfill a moral obligation, that is to do like whatever is best for their children. When we benefit the children because they can get away from abusive parents and there's depolarization of ideas and opinions. When we benefit communities because of the interpersonal relationships and that we create on our side of the house, we on side proposition feel the need to propose a motion today. This house would prefer a world with communal parenting. First, some framing, then moving on to my burdens, and then my two constructive arguments. First, onto framing. This house would be the world because obviously children exist all over the world, so this would apply to rural communities as well as big suburbs and like big cities, because as we've established, children exist all around the world. Children would still be 18 and under because 18 is the age of adulthood in the majority of countries, and this shouldn't change in this debate. Raising communally would children become the responsibility of the whole community. This looks like small towns or villages, but in bigger areas like cities, this looks like neighborhoods because it is impossible for an entire city of hundreds of thousands or even millions to raise a child and create a close relationship with them. So we think neighborhoods are like more realistic. However, biological parents and legal guardians would still have legal rights over the children while the whole community can take care of them. Why is this? We think that while children are being raised by others, they are still their parents. You cannot split the legal rights of a child over an entire community. Parents are the ones who have those kids, therefore they need to have a certain level of accountability over them. Furthermore, we're not saying that children will rely on the community for their entire lives because they will go to grade school and like high school outside of their community and visit stores and areas outside of the community. So it's likely that we'll still see many children having friends and relationships outside of their community, as well as like interpersonal relationships within that community. This can only happen on our side of the house. Now onto my burdens. Basically, we think that we benefit the parents because these parents have a moral obligation to do whatever like best for their children, and they have to fulfill that for the parents if the children are being neglected, if they're like away at work, if they cannot come home like soon enough. Second, we think that we benefit the children because they get away from abusive parents. There's a depolarization of ideas and opinions because they're being exposed to different perspectives. Third, we're benefiting the communities because we're creating interpersonal relationships and we tie the community together on our side of the house. This being said, are there any POIs from the other side of the house? Okay, moving on to my first. Oh, okay, yeah, I'll take it.
To the point that these individuals still have like full legal control over the child, how do they ever get away from abusive situations if they could just move?
Okay, you kind of cut out there, but I think I got the gist of your POI. Basically, we think that even if these parents have like legal rights over these children, they can still like, spend time outside of their home. And this is more likely to happen on our side of the house because there is communal parenting. They can spend time with other like people who like don't mistreat them. We think that this only happens on our side of the house. That being said, moving on to my first constructive argument about the parental obligation and how our side of the house supports parents. We think that parents have a moral obligation to provide whatever best for their children. If, for example, these parents are busy at work or cannot come home to spend time with their kid, we would prefer that child to be raised communally instead of having them in like a daycare with a babysitter. Why is this? These children can then develop interpersonal relationships and close connections with those around them, and this is less likely to happen in like a daycare center with like a huge group of children that is being taken care of like one or two caretakers. They usually don't get any like one-on-one time with these teachers, and like furthermore, a child's time at a daycare is short since they're only there until they graduate, like 2 or 3 years at most, whereas a child in a communal system could be with the same adults or caretakers for life, therefore establishing better relationship with them. So even if we don't get close relationships with community, children are less likely to develop relationships with daycares. I think I've established that here. Second, children have like a better sense of belonging because they like how much they're involved with communities, how much time they spend with people in the communities, and like this strengthens bonds between people they actually see every day. My partner will be talking about this in his speech. Also, if your parents are busy with work or cannot come home until like a really late hour, this is what's best for them because it is better to like it's better to do this than neglect them and to like leave them at home, and because they have a more of a sense of community, not just isolation with like a caretaker or a babysitter. Also, parents often can't afford a caretaker, so this is even better. We don't want latchkey situations to happen, which is often what like occurs when parents can't afford to send their kids to like daycares, can't afford nannies. No, thank you. Obviously, like think that like all children should get some type of guidance from adults, so like therefore we don't want children to take care of themselves, which is what happens when like parents can't afford this. And note that schools do not apply to this point because schools end at 3 p.m., whereas kids as young as the age of 5 often take care of themselves or are taken care of by their siblings who are not much older until like 9 or 10 in the evening, or until like however late their parents come back home. Like their biological parents or legal guardians are also likely to reciprocate the action of them taking care of like other kids when they have the time, or can pay them in things like other than money, for example, home cooked meals or something of the like. On to my second argument then about the benefits to children and how communal parenting actually benefits the children more than like, in the status quo. A couple of points of characterization under this. First, this argument mainly applies to those with abusive parents that they mistreat their children. It is extremely unlikely for an entire community to be abusive, so we're not subjecting them to more abusers or like more irresponsible people. So even if these children like grow up in a more rundown neighborhood, it is extremely likely that all the parents will mistreat their kids. And like notice that it is possible, but at extremely low chance because there are checks and balances with the community. If children are being abused, others will like scrutinize or report if these like to the city or to the police. Because these people like develop good relationship with these children, they want what's best for them. So if their parents are being abusive or if other like adults are being abusive, they are going to report them. Second, this would also apply to parents with extremely strong opinions on controversial topics. We'd want to expose them to more opinions than those of their biological parents or legal guardians. That being said, let's talk about abusive parents. When kids have abusive parents, they are mistreated. However, when we have communal parenting, children don't need to spend as much time at home because they can be raised by other parents and like by other adults that treat them better and to like treat them well and like, don't generally mistreat or abuse them. And even if they do spend time at home and like still mistreated, like these checks and balances will be like in place. People will like scrutinize, shame, or like report these parents if they're being abusive.
Point.
Second, our sub point on radical ideas and depolarization. No, thank you. If children are being raised by parents who express their opinions on like racism, sexism, and like political and like social views, kids will pick that up, maybe even develop them into their own opinions. However, this is less likely to happen on the side of the house because an entire community or people aren't going to be inherently racist. We cannot assume that. What does happen inside on our side of the house though? Children are exposed to more like ideas than just those of their parents. They can get different perspectives on politics, racism, and like note that like different perspectives are beneficial in general, but especially when parents have radical ideas that they keep trying to instill in their children. This looks like social and like political views when the children should be able to develop their own ideas about it, which will happen if they're exposed to more ideas, not just one. For example, like in the UK, if you're exposed to both like ideas of both Labour and Conservative parties, you are likely going to develop your own ideas instead of just listening to one group talk about it and one group trying to instill their views into you. Even if they learn about politics at school, their opinions are more likely to be like heavily influenced at home or heavily influenced by people who like raise them because they're the people that they trust. This will result in a depolarization of opinions. When like this happens because there are more people vested into one child. They're not just listening to one group of people, like trying to like change their opinion at home, and like they're not just like being subjected to one like idea. They listen to multiple ideas. That is why we think that they are likely to form their own opinion on our side of the house. So when we benefit the children and we benefit the parents, we are so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that opening speech. If all the judges will just nod at me that you're ready. Okay, great. All right, then we will now begin to the first speech for side opposition.
Am I audible? And then if you want to give me a POI, I'll accept visual. So if you can put your hand up in the screen or just like signal me, I'll accept it or I'll wave you down. With that being said, it is quite worrisome that Proposition decided to predicate their entire case on a child's ability to foster deep connections with multiple individuals in a community because they're not going to have one single parental figure, completely ignoring the fact that having lots of figures offering differing viewpoints and differing perspectives of authority makes it difficult for a child to get a deep connection with anyone in that community. Today, I'm going to be doing three things in my speech. First, giving you our stance as side opposition. Second, refuting the case the proposition has given us thus far. And third, providing our first two of three substantive arguments covering the principal and practical implications of the motion. With that being said, what's our stance? Two things. First, we believe that it is principally unjust to force a child into a situation where every adult in their lives has the ultimate authority over their actions and beliefs. But secondly, we support a world similar to what we see in most of the world today, where a child typically has two parental authority figures, but is exposed to lots of differing levels of authority and perspectives throughout life, whether this be teachers, police officers, or their peers. Knowing this, let's get on to what we've seen coming out of side proposition today. They present us two key substantive arguments. The first one talking about the parental obligation, largely dealing with the principal implications of their side. They talk about how the community is going to be better than daycare because you're getting more personal relationships with a single individual because you're not going to be surrounded by lots of kids getting this single care, and you're going to be getting this care for a lot longer than you would in a daycare where it's like 2 to 3 years. Two responses to this. First, it's important to note that it's not just a single child being cared for by 100 members of a community. It's hundreds of children being cared for by hundreds of members of a community. Therefore, all these parents that aren't able to like come home early enough to care for their children and have to have someone else care for them are going to have lots of children involved in this. You're still seeing really the same stimulation as daycare. So you're not seeing any real benefits when it comes to like personal connections with your care provider. You're just putting them in a situation where you're going to be seeing this for a lot longer. But we don't think that this longer period is actually justified because in lots of the time, children get to a point where they can sustain themselves, where they can stay home, where they don't necessarily need to go to daycare after school. We think at that point, the burden that you're getting and the benefit that you're getting from these parents or these individuals in the community caring for the child is mute because they're not really caring for them for these solid 8 years. They're just being involved in their life for their entire like first 18 years of growth. We think on both sides of the house, we see involvement from the community. You just see it in a different way than we do. We don't think that this is uniquely beneficial. But then you try and tell us that we're getting a lot better of a connection with the community because these people are going to be more involved. So they're going to feel more connected because they're getting a lot of authority figures from their community. We would say that this is a really odd and non-unique argument to make when it comes to children being connected to their community, because you never provide the necessary link showing how all these people having authority over children is going to establish this connection instead of all these people being involved in their children's lives. We think it's more effective for these people to be involved in the children's lives, whether that be through like kind of mentoring them throughout life, rather than telling them, hey, you're grounded, you can't do this, we don't think like that. We think that that is actually negative for the child, and it provides them a lot of conflicting interests when it comes to their own thinking. But onto your second substantive, when you're talking about how this actually benefits the children. You say that this is mainly applying to children who are abused, and we agree that there is checks and balances in a community, and you're not really going to be exposing a lot of children to a lot of abuse if you're saying giving these like abusive parents or abusive individuals' authority over a child. We agree with that. However, we would say that communal parenting and the model that you established where you're giving these individuals and these biological parents the legal authority over these children isn't necessarily dampening their abuse, and it's not necessarily hindering it in any way, shape, or form. Just because these children can get out of the house in your world doesn't mean they can't in ours, but in your world, you're just giving them more opportunities to be abused by these multiple individuals, even if there are checks and balances. We think checks and balances exist in both worlds. In our world, if a parent is abusive, we see CPS coming and telling them not to be abusive. We see them taking the child away. We don't think that's unique. We don't think that you're burdening us with the sole existence of abuse. And then you try and tell us that we're getting lots of perspectives from differing viewpoints, and that you're more likely to accept views from the home currently because this is a figure that you trust, and you're not going to be accepting like these radical racist viewpoints. A few notes on this. First, children getting this stable foundation from their parents establishes their ability to see diversity in their community and to accept it if they want to. We think giving them all of these multiple radical perspectives and not giving them a solid foundation doesn't actually allow for them to form their own opinions and doesn't allow them to appreciate and recognize this diversity in a meaningful way. We don't think you're uniquely solving for lots of children being racist. We think you're just making it into a situation where they're not going to be able to provide a consistent thought for themselves. But let's get on to our substantive material. The first one being the principle, but before I do so, I'll take your point.
If it is unjust to force communal parenting onto a child, then it is also unjust to force parents onto a child.
We think that there is a clear distinction between communal parenting and children going to parents. One, because in most cases, parents choose to have their child, so they choose to maintain the legal authority over their child. If they did not want to, they could put them up for adoption. We don't think that this like obligation that you're trying to make the link to is necessarily true. But furthermore, we would say that it is more principally unjust to force the community to have the burden of raising this child when they didn't choose to have a child in the first place. We think that that obligation is actually more detrimental on your side of the house. But on to our substantive. The parental choice to raise a child of their own is lost as other authority figures enter the picture and push their own ideals and shape the foundation of parenthood. At the end of the day, it is important to recognize that the principle of raising your own children and having that choice takes away this autonomy and uniquely bonds between a parent and a child. Why do we think that this principle is important? Two reasons. First, we foster deeper bonds between a parent and a child. We would argue that a deeper bond with one individual is a lot better than multiple bonds of less significance within a community because it fosters emotional stability and a feeling of security with one individual. But secondly, emotional relationships are developed and parents feel the need to give constant affection and care to their children, in most instances excluding those that are abused. In your world, parents aren't feeling this moral obligation because they have normalized communal parenting and they haven't like implied and justified this intense connection. But secondly, the morality of choice to raise a child allows these parents to be significant figures in their child's life. It's quite clear that children are often characterized as gifts, and people choosing to raise these gifts because they reflect small bundles of joy that bring light into these adults' lives. On their side of the house, children are objectified and passed around the community, not to one parent's like obligation to one's ownership, but to everyone's, where everyone feels they have the same authority over them. But on our second substantive, the practical. In propositions world, it's practically fundamentally harms the most vulnerable stakeholder in today's debate, children. This is done in three key ways. First, you establish a communal parenting system with multiple parents and children raised among one another, forces children to compete with one another for the community's affection and support, similar to the intense pressure faced by children in high school as they compete to be at the top of the social hierarchy. Except now this feeling of stress and competition is brought into every facet of their lives. This is uniquely detrimental because these children will no longer have a place to go to escape this feeling. But secondly, having a large group of parental authority figures with differing opinions takes away a child's ability to have a stable foundation for thinking based off of the consistent narrative they receive from parents in our world. Two key reasons why this is important. First, you're taking away their foundation for future success, whether that be academically, personally, or financially, because their decision-making process will always be bogged down by competing interests. But secondly, you're hurting their ability to recognize and accept diversity of thought in a meaningful way. But third, and most importantly, having multiple parental authority figures, which are typically seen as the most important authority figures by a child, makes them more complacent to injustices and abuses in the world and in their community. In our world, we allow the children to reject certain actions taken by individuals other than their parents. This looks like teachers teaching them not to have everyone has their best interests at heart. But in the propositions world, children would be so conditioned to accept what these different adults tell them that they won't know how to remove themselves from a situation that is undesirable. Similar to how children are faced with a great internal struggle when they attempt to reject something their parent has said in the status quo. Vote opposition because we're the only ones that actually care about the child's ability to succeed in the present and the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. Appreciate it. Judges, if you'll just look up when you're ready to go. Okay, waiting for, good. All right. We will now move to hear a speech from the second speaker for side government. You're here.
All right, I'm just gonna grab my timer. I'll take verbal POIs, please. When the status quo fails communities as a whole and the people in them, that is where we draw the line so that this motion must pass. Never been prouder to propose. In this speech, a few things for you. First, I'll be doing some rebuttal. Secondly, some reconstruction. And finally, moving on to the third point on our side concerning benefits to communities. So let's move on to some rebuttal. They bring you 2 points. Before I get into that, I just want to attack their stance a little bit because they tell you that, like, you know, they don't support everyone having ultimate authority over like every child. They don't support every person in the community being able to control the child's every move. And we agree with that. That's not what the motion actually did. That's not what the model actually did. We said to you that the parents are ultimately the ones that will have the ultimate authority. They're the ones with the legal authority, while these people will just be other authority figures in their lives, other relationships they can make, a safety net for them in times of need. So we think that they kind of mischaracterize that. They can't really take that as their stance because that's just completely different from our model, completely different from the world this is actually taking place in. But, you know, we can accept that for now and take them at their best. So let's move on to some rebuttal. They bring you 2 points on their side. Firstly, the principle. Secondly, the practical. So under the principle, they tell you that basically parents won't have autonomy. They tell you that parents deserve to have this autonomy, and they just won't on our side of the house. So basically, firstly, we think that as explained in the model, parents will still have a certain amount of autonomy because they are still the legal guardian, because they still have that, no, thank you, legal authority. However, there is also the other community members that can be a part of their life that they can have close relationships with. We think this is extremely beneficial and extra benefit that they don't get on their side of the house. But secondly, we think that on our side of the house, you're not going to have a ton of not close relationships. You're going to have a ton of people that you truly trust because they're the ones that are helping to raise you. They're the ones that are helping to make you who you are as well as your parents. So you're going to have these extra relationships, these extra authority figures that are going to help you develop, not just some like random people that you barely know that are like randomly taking care of you from now and then. We think that's the kind of mischaracterization that they make to you on their side of the house. We think it's actually very beneficial to know all these people, to have these benefits without actually sacrificing the principle of parenting. Now, the second point they bring you is about the practical. And they basically told you why, like, basically these people are going to be very stressed because they're competing with other kids in their community for like attention and whatever. And firstly, they never actually explain why competition exists, right? Because we don't understand why people can't just take care of all the kids in the community without competition. It's pretty, they didn't really give you a mechanism for this. They didn't really give you any analysis to why this will ultimately occur. They only got to this in the last minute of their speech. No, thank you. So it wasn't very well developed. We don't really understand the mechanism behind this. But even if we accept that, we think that there is a place to go for these people to like express their stress on our side of the house when they have these authority figures, when they have these people that are actually able to support them because they have these extra close relationships. So they can go to people other than their parents to express things like stress, to express things like mental stress that can help them relieve their opinions, help them relieve any stress that they feel inside because they have these other safe spaces to go other than their parents, other trusted adults to go to. I think it's actually more beneficial for stress on our side of the house. Yeah. I'll take the POI.
Why uniquely do these people that the children are going to have authority? Why can't they be like counselors in our world that we see in schools where children go and talk to? Why do they need to have parental authority over these children?
Parental authority and authority figure are a very different thing. I don't think you guys have actually made that differentiation. And we did in our model. So basically, having an authority figure is basically just someone who you look up to, someone who not necessarily is your parent, but someone who you think is basically like someone who can take care of you, someone who you spend time with, someone who does have a certain amount of authority, but they're not your parent. They're not like an extreme authority figure. They're not your legal guardian. That's an extremely important distinction, extremely important characterization. So it's a completely different thing. We think that having an authority, basically having authority is having that connection. We think that we actually are the ones to make that connection, not you guys. But I'll talk about my point. So on to some reconstruction. My partner brings you 2 points. Firstly, about parental obligation. Secondly, about parental benefits to children. Under parental obligation, she tells you that we're providing a safety net for kids, that parents are ultimately doing what's best for them on our side of the house, fulfilling the parental obligation on our side of the house. They told you 3 things. Firstly, they told you that tons of children, like there's like hundreds of children, hundreds of people. That means it's like daycare. And basically like it's the same thing on our side of the house. Okay, we agree that it's like daycare, but it's actually much better because you have these close relationships. It's not like 2 people and 100 kids. It's 100 people and 100 kids, or 100 people and like 5 kids. Like you're not going to have a ton of kids with not very many people. It's actually the opposite. So you have these close relationships that you can make. You have these like close relationships, you have this connection with these people. So it's actually much better on our side of the house. Secondly, they told you that children will be able to care for themselves when they're older. So like this doesn't really apply when they're older. Sure, it doesn't like apply as much when they're older, but even so, having these relationships, having these connections are actually going to be very beneficial throughout their entire life. I think like having more relationships is always going to be more beneficial. Having a safety net is always going to be more beneficial. And then lastly, thank you. They told you like that this thing is just authority. It's not a connection. I think my partner, I'm going to prove this to you, my point, but basically we think that when you're taking care of a child, you're going to form a connection. You're going to form some sort of relationship. You're not just going to be like telling them you're grounded all the time. So that's, again, mischaracterization, but we think that it's also like not true. We think that you're actually going to be able to form this connection. It's not just authority. Then my partner told you about benefits to children. She told you about like how basically there's abusive parents, how we're going to cause depolarization, how we're going to basically get rid of abuse. They give you 3 responses. Firstly, they told you that there's more abuse opportunities on our side of the house. We think that abuse exists on both sides. Just on our side of the house, we're going to have more checks and balances because they're not going to have as tight knit of a relationship with the community, not going to have as good of a relationship with the community. So on our side of the house, we have these checks and balances, and we have this like extra people that they can take care of them, extra safe spaces for them to go to. And then lastly, they told you like about the diversity of opinions and how that exists on both sides. Sure, that exists on both sides. But again, all this is existing under assumption that they're close with the community already. We're actually the only side that's able to uniquely create this connection because you're having this parental relationship, but not quite parental because you're having this connection of taking care of someone else's kids. So I'm going to move on to my constructive point. It's about benefits to community. And we realize that this sort of communal raising happens sometimes in the status quo, but it's usually at a very small scale, and most of the community is not often involved in this process. With the rise of the suburbs and people becoming more isolated from each other, especially after a devastating pandemic, we think this is becoming a huge issue. So often people don't know each other even if they live right beside each other. We think this is a missed opportunity, and we want to change this. So why do we change this? Well, ultimately, when a whole community is working together to raise children, they're going to get to know each other. Taking care of someone else's kids is a pretty huge deal because these kids are extremely important to the parents. They are their most beloved. No, thank you. So knowing that those parents trust them enough to take care of their most beloved, there then be a tight-knit bond that will begin to form. And when you have these strong interpersonal relationships, you'll see things like block parties, because good friends living close to one another will obviously want to spend time together. And when you're good friends with your whole area will come to these block parties and other gatherings and get to know each other, bringing the community together.
Point.
So why does this actually matter? No, thank you. First, it solves the issue of isolation. As I talked about in my characterization, many people basically just keep to themselves nowadays. And even before the pandemic, communities that know each other well are becoming things of the past. This has a whole host of issues such as loneliness or dementia later in life. But when you have all these amazing relationships, you're not going to live in isolation because you're not going to be on your own all the time because you've been taking care of a child, because you've been forming these relationships with the parent, with the child. You'll be out at these events, spending time with people and enjoying life, solving this issue and ensuring that the long-term and short-term consequences of isolation are not felt. But second, and most importantly, it creates a safety net for the community as a whole and not just the children, because everyone needs support. Everyone needs someone to lean on. And often that safety net is quite small for most people. But using the same mechanism, when you have these relationships, when you're close to the others in your community, that safety net grows exponentially bigger. So if someone is in a darker place or if they're feeling down or anything else, they have this support. They'll have these relationships that, as I explained before, would not exist inside ops world, or if they did, they would not be very strong because there isn't this familial ties, because you're not raising someone else's children, you're not forming this connection with the parents, you're not forming this connection with the children. But it also has these long-term impacts because as people begin to have kids and everyone takes care of them, those kids will feel nothing but trust of people that raise them, the others in their community, making them more than comfortable to allow those nearby to take care of their own kids, having an amazing relationship with them. So ultimately, the cycle continues. We create communities that are tightly knit, that trust each other, that are having block parties all the time, and enjoying life to the fullest with people they enjoy spending time with, because we want what's best for every actor in this debate. We've never been prouder to propose this motion.
Thank you. All right, if judges will look up and indicate that you're ready, great. Okay, good. All right, we will now move to the second speaker for side opposition. You're here.
Am I audible? Perfect. In today's speech, I'll be doing 3 things. First off, we're going to go off some key misconceptions and strategic errors made by side proposition in today's debate before going down the throat and addressing like where we win in today's round and doing a little bit of both rebuttaling and reconstruction before finally introducing you our third substantive, talking about cultural preservation. Let's get right into it. First off, when it comes to like the notion of authority, let's go ahead and clarify before it gets even more muddled down the bench. We think that authority in this situation would have to look more like parental authority. They tell you they give parents the legal rights to their child. Yes, we agree they have those in the status quo. It comes to signing medical bills or field trip slips. However, when they tell you that raising a child is the role these individuals have in the community, we see more of an instance of parental authority. These are not just teachers telling them what to do or giving them assignments. These are individuals teaching them how to think, how to be, how to behave, and what is acceptable both in their eyes and in society's eyes. Let's go ahead and analyze why this is a problem with side propositions model. This means that any individual who is like in charge of this child is now giving their opinions and their beliefs to this child. They're no longer hearing it from one source. They no longer have the ability to come up with their own opinions once they've like reached school age and made friends. Recognize that when you're like perpetuated with tons of different opinions at a really young age, you start to wonder what's true. You begin to question all senses of authority, and you lose those stable interpersonal relationships proposition is so strongly advocating for. Why is this? Let's go ahead and get into some analysis about why we lose those interpersonal communications, looking down their first substantive when it comes to a parental obligation. We think that you do not have these interpersonal relationships with individuals other than your own biological parents if they're the ones who are like raising you. Instead of having like a child to a parent bond where you understand that person is supposed to be in your corner 24/7, now you have 20 other individuals that are supposed to be that figure. You lose the ability to connect implicitly with one individual whom you can completely devote yourself to. And now instead of that, you have tons of different individuals devoting themselves to tons of different children. We give you the analogy of like a high school hierarchy. They tell you this doesn't apply because we never link out competition. Recognize in a classroom, as we're all familiar with, there are both teacher pets and individuals that the teacher doesn't necessarily get along with. We would see that same kind of hierarchy being now brought into a child's home life when they're competing affection of tons of different members in the community against like tons of different children in the community. We would rather have at least one child have a person who is standing in their corner. Why do we not get this on their side of the house? This is because all of these children are passed around and objectified. You're no longer one person's child, you're everyone's, and someone just has a little legal signature to top it off with. We don't think that this looks like a homogeneous neighborhood. We instead think it looks like one where children are competing for affection, parents lose their bonds with children, and we see more and more like unstable relationships as they get older because they don't learn to question authority figures. They don't learn how to like make these interpersonal relationships because it's been perpetuated by like authorities for so long. They lose the ability to be independent because we don't give them a chance to go out and try and learn to take care of themselves on their own once they've gotten to those ages. Plus, it adapts them to this idea that like nothing's ever going to change. Recognize putting children in daycares or like with babysitters and giving them the ability to like go to school in different situations is good for a child because it teaches them that change is a natural facet of life. When you put them in a community, you take away these different changing aspects of society and make them think that it's all going to stay the exact same way. This makes them more scared to adventure out on their own in society and makes them less likely to be able to adapt and handle change better, no matter the support system behind them, because you've already eroded their sense of change. We think this is the net detriment to side proposition that we don't see on our side of the house. Let's get into our second substantive here where they tell you about like childhood benefits. We do not think that we're going to see a better situation for abuse victims on their side of the house. Let's go ahead and get into this. First off, there are legal ramifications on both sides of the house. We understand this. But at the point that their solvent for abuse is for a child to go to a different house in the community, we see more net benefits because CPS or any other child protective services take the child completely out of the situation. When their only resource is to go to another house in the community, they're still constantly being seen by their abuser. They're still constantly having to interact with them and they still live by them. They still have legal authority over them. Just because a child can walk away from the house doesn't mean that unless a government doesn't intervene, we don't see any solvency. The child doesn't get away from the abusive situation. At the point that they become complacent with fixing abuse at a moment of like moving houses, they lose that point because the child is never their first priority. It's block parties. Now let's move on to their third substantive here, where they tell you that like isolation happens and like these individuals no longer feel connected. I'd like to ask them why they think that passing around children is a fair way to solve isolation. Recognize when you move to a new neighborhood, you don't automatically know your neighbors. You're not automatically friends with them. Forcing this idea of like communal raising on individuals who grew up isolated just makes them feel more afraid because now they're worried about their children. They're forced into a situation where they have to care for other people's children in order to have any sort of those reprocreated feelings by them. And we don't see an increase in like people communicating with each other. Now it's just like foregone babysitters. Yes, send your kid down the street. There's no implicit link there that you're going to trust the people around you. Most of the time, you just grow complacent with a situation. We see no benefits on their side of the house when it comes to like decreased isolation. We just see children walking around and having more individuals that are there to like be an authority figure and to control them. Then let's go ahead and take that point.
How does your side prevent the neglection of children when it's becoming more and more difficult to actually parent in the status quo?
Recognize that a child does have many outlets. We think that because we have so much social media, and we've seen, especially in the pandemic, how children use that to create connections that are meaningful to them, not those you impose upon them, not ones where authority figures are creating them, but instead where children are able to create them. In the pandemic, we saw this like peak at an all-time high, but then outside of the pandemic, we still saw children becoming friends with their neighbors and friends with people like in their vicinity or at their school. That doesn't change on your side of the house. We still see interpersonal relationships and benefits for the child on ours. But now let's recognize a couple of these like things on our side of the house. They tell you that like it creates more relationships and tons of trust. Recognize the situations we see of like communal learning don't always look like individuals who are there for the child. This can look like cults, it could look like tribes, where you're like passing down this one idea of like individuals constantly like raising their child together. Those are real world impacts we see from like the actual communal raising aspects. You can see good things like Native American tribes, but you can see bad things like the Manson children. We don't think they have any like unique or implicit benefits. But then our third substantive when it comes to cultural preservation here is that when individuals are not like community raised, they're reliant more on their parents for the passing down of traditions and things. Look to our third speaker who's here and learns like most of her traditions from her parents because she lives in like a multicultural household. If she was raised in a community of individuals with tons of these like diverse traditions and pasts, she wouldn't have such a connection to her culture or her ideals. Instead, she would become what some would call whitewashed and like facing multiple different traditions without like that purity of her family's traditions passing down to them. Because we believe in cultural preservation, we love a world with more diversity that allows for America to be a melting pot. We love a world that allows the passing of unique traditions down through family lines. And we love a world that has a parent and a culture to be a guiding factor over a simple, like, subject to change community. Because we believe in the child, because we protect the future, vote side opposition.
Thank you very much. Okay, judges, are we ready? Yes, 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 yes. Okay. We are now ready for the third proposition speaker.
I prefer verbal POIs. I just need a second to set up my timer. Sorry. So my speech starts on my first word. Inside Op's world, children are increasingly neglected. They're increasingly neglected as each and every family is more isolated, each parent is more likely to spend more hours at work, and each child is more likely to socialize less and interact less with the outside world. The fact is, one parent, even two, isn't enough to meet the myriad of both tangible and emotional needs of a growing child in today's world. And with all the factors of school, work, extracurricular activities, and hobbies in place, it is because we present to you a realistic world, a world that is already in motion, that we win this debate. When we see successful communal parenting across the world, in China, in Bangladesh, in Israel, we believe that this preference for communal parenting would lead to a world where children are more connected, community-based, and parents are not stressed and stretched thin when everything and everyone is becoming more and more polarized. Parents still have the last word over decisions they make, but they are supported by trusted community members that live in the vicinity. So a couple of clarifications at the top of my speech. In terms of the difference between an actual parent's authority and the authority that community members have, we think that there's a huge difference. On top of the fact that actual parents have legal authority, children still have the largest and strongest connection with their parents because they live under the same roof. They live together, while community members would help with things like homework, play, support, if parents are not available for work or some other reason. If you were to buy opposition's characterization of authority, you would also have to buy the fact that families with grandparents do horribly because grandparents are figures of authority that are not parents. Notice, community members then are even less of a parental authority because they aren't related like grandparents are. So, as third speaker on side proposition, I'll be looking at this debate under two main questions. First, who benefits the most vulnerable actor in this debate? The children. And second, who better supports children? So, first, under who benefits the children. First critical clash in this debate under this question is about the treatment of children. Side op tells us that children are more likely to be abused on our side of the house, and they tell you that we subject them to more abusers. We respond by telling you that first, parents are less likely to trust people that seem suspicious, making it less likely for them to form a communal relationship with someone that their child or even themselves don't feel comfortable around. We just don't see this happening. Second, due to the close bonds formed between those in the community over time, we think it is more likely that an abused child would find someone to speak up to and get help from because there's more checks and balances in place because
Point.
children have other adults that they feel like they can talk to. No, thank you. It is often difficult for children to talk to their parents about uncomfortable subjects, and this is exclusive to our side. We also think that children are less likely to go to counselors like they tell us because the counselors, they're not used to these counselors. They don't know these counselors very well. It's just less likely to happen. And we think that there would be less tolerance by parents on our side of the house because they feel an emotional attachment to the child not currently experienced in the status quo. This means that if they see a child has signs of abuse, they're more likely to say something instead of turning a blind eye that would happen on their side of the house. And we also see that when abusive parenting happens, it's when parents are stretched thin, when they struggle to find work-life balance, when they struggle to provide for their children. We support these children on our side with communal parenting. But why is this truly important to today's debate? First, abuse exists on both sides of the house. It's likely to keep occurring on both sides of the house, but with communal parenting, we decrease the chances of it occurring because we create safer communities, better communities that might not exist otherwise. Second, we also provide more trusted community members who children can talk to should they need to, and trusted community members that can help them. Even if we take this point at its best, we're still getting the same effect of abusive parents on both sides of the house. However, our side still outweighs because our side exclusively supplies at-risk children with more close interpersonal relationships. Moreover, we are less likely to have abusive parents and have children subject to abusers because it's extremely unlikely that an entire community will be abusive or support abusiveness. And checks and balances, their side completely dismissed the point. They told you that it isn't relevant and that it isn't applicable, but they didn't respond to the mechanism. They also told us that children wouldn't be able to make their own opinions, find their own perspective on the world. A couple of short responses on this. First of all, this isn't exclusive on our side of the house. Children struggle with their opinions and perspective throughout their lives regardless. And it's a parent's job to introduce them to everything possible so that they can develop their own ideas. But when parents can't provide these outlets that side opposition talks about, or they only provide one opinion or like one bias, then the communities are able to give a variety of opinions. And, they tell us about like they can turn to social media and things like that. But we think that's even worse because social media just will make them even more confused about the world and their perspective. No, thank you. And we think that the characterization is very extreme on their side of the house, and we think that it is frankly very unlikely. But furthermore, we think we see a similar effect on side opposition anyways with the current issue of like helicopter parenting on the rise. Second question, who better supports parents? The critical clash under this is whether or not parents can fulfill their role. Side opposition tells us that parents can't fulfill their moral obligations because their children are passed around the community, and because of this, they tell us that parents cannot foster strong relationships with their children. They also bring up this idea of competition and that it's just a bunch of children under a bunch of people, and it's just more neglect. A couple of responses here. The framing of their world is not very realistic because it's very difficult for parents to spend a lot of time with their children for a variety of factors. First, we have things like single parents. Single parents have to work a lot. Even normal parents, like if you have a nuclear family, your parents still have to work a lot in today's world. And if you have say a poor family, someone who is lower in who just doesn't make as much, then they all might have to spend more time outside their house as well. And sometimes we just don't have parents who are emotionally available, and the parents that neglect children on our side are also going to neglect children on side opposition. It's worse on side opposition, though, because they don't have that safety net we talked about in our first argument. The neglect that occurs on their side of the house is even more isolating. So even if there is more neglect due to communal parenting, that neglect isn't necessarily as bad because it's actually made up for with other guardians and adults that can fill that role. Furthermore, if we take side-off's point about how parental authority weakens family, they're essentially claiming that any child who lives under their extended family, such as grandparents, is automatically unstable due to this so-called overload of authority figures. No, thank you. Now, we get to this point of cultural preservation, in which they describe how children are going to lose their cultural identities due to being part of communal raising. We think that instead of like being, we think that when we have all these children together, we actually have all these cultures being celebrated, right? We have this idea, we have this air of inclusivity, right? We're not like suppressing people when we have a community, right? When you have a community, when you have this accepting community that we talk about, we have people that pride themselves on multiculturalism, and not everyone becomes whitewashed, as they say. We believe that like in communities where like we have different ethnicities, different races, these cultures can like teach each other about acceptance. At the end of the day, side op has lost this debate because we're unsure of the outcomes on their side of the house. We're unsure of what happens to our children and their parents, and we're unsure of the overall outcome of society on their side of the house. They've also failed to prove how there would be less competition and less isolation. And they've made assumptions about what communal parenting looks like. They assume that it looks like all these parents dumping their children on one set of parents, when we've repeatedly proved to you that it's not. On side proposition, we've told you that we will support parents, children, and the community because we ensure benefits for all three actors. It's because of the overall outcome on side of their house. It's because we set up children and parents and communities for success. It's because we prevent isolation, and it's because we benefit both children and parents, and it's because we live in a realistic world. So proud to propose.
Thank you very much. I'll wait for the judges to look up. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, okay. We are now ready for the third speaker for side opposition to close the constructive material.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, for my speech, if it's okay, I'd like to have visual POIs. So just like wave your hand on the screen. At the end of the day, team proposition didn't truly characterize what their world looks like when they are lessening the influence of these primary care providers because they characterize these individuals of the community to just help with homework, or when the parent isn't available, they'll just drive them to school or take them to their house. At the end of the day, what we prioritize is the moral obligation of these primary care providers and also the emotional stability. I am so proud to oppose. In my speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, 2 strategic mistakes made by team proposition. Secondly, the 2 key clashes of today's debate. First, is it principally justified to put children under the care of the community? And second, practically, is it better to raise children through the community? Then I'll be giving a few reasons onto ultimately why team opposition has won today's debate. But now let's go on to strategic mistakes. What do they try to tell you throughout the bench? First is the sense of community. I don't specifically think, and they never prove this in any of their speeches, why you will lose a sense of community in our side of the house. I don't specifically think you have to put the obligation of community members to raise their children, and therefore all of a sudden these block parties are going to go away. But second, on this whole argument that keep on prioritizing in today's debate about abusive relations, understand as being moral individuals, I don't specifically think interpersonal relationships are needed to call out abusive relations. At the end of the day, when an adult sees an abuse, when they see signs of children being abused at their household, I don't specifically think that they need the connection to have actually calling out these types of relations. At the end of the day, I still think in our side of the house, we have that outlet. Let's go on to the first key clash of today's debate. Is it principally justified to put children under the care of the community? What do they try to tell you in their first substantive argument? They talked about parental obligation, how they're going to develop interpersonal relationships, and they characterize this as better than daycare, how they're going to strengthen bonds with other children, and children need guidance from adults. We have two main responses to this. First, inversely, we think their side lacks interpersonal relationships because they can't specifically prioritize relationships with these children in the first place. When you have a primary care provider, when you have these children mainly in their household and you have a foundation of influence, we think there's better in strengthening bonds within the children and the adults in the first place. These bonds lack. But secondly, I find it very worrisome that they start their sub with parents are going to be busy and therefore we should take care of their children, yet they still think that this is better than daycare. Understand the role of the parent in the first place is to create a stable foundation for these children. They give access of foundation through these impacts, through unique perspectives of these parents. We think we specifically proved this through our analysis in our first substantive argument when we talked about the principle. First, we have a deeper bond that is better than having multiple bonds of different communities of the members. Because at the end of the day, when you have a specific and strengthening bond of one individual, one primary care provider versus one child, that is better than having the less of a strength bond within multiple members of the community because you have emotional stability, because you have security. Because understand, in their side of the house, parents won't have the obligation to actually take care of their children at that extent. They don't have the obligation to put that much influence on their children to that extent. They don't want to provide the emotional stability because they think the community members will do that better, even though we proved to you they don't even have that incentive in the first place. But secondly, we have the morality of choice. Understand, parents choose to adopt individuals. Parents choose to have these individuals because they want someone primarily in their life, because they want to influence someone. They want to have a bundle of joy in their household. You lose that incentive in their side of the house when they think other community members are going to be that type of influence. You lose that obligation to have these children, to adopt these children, the intentions of symbolism of having these children in the first place. But now let's go on to our second key question. Practically, is it better to raise children through a community? What did they tell you in their second substantive argument? They talked about the benefits to children. This mainly applies to children who are abused because we have checks and balances throughout a community and we get multiple perspectives. So we have like a variety and diverse different viewpoints. We have two main responses to this. First, I already told you I don't think interpersonal relationship is going to be needed to call out abusive relationships. Because at the end of the day, we still have different outlets in which we can tell counselors, but we can still tell community members, hey, I'm in an abusive relationship. But I still think because of the atrocity of abusive relationship, I don't specifically think our children is going to have someone who primarily takes care, or someone in a community member who takes care of them to tell them, hey, I'm in an abusive relationship. Because the atrocity of the abusive relationship, I still think, and whoever that they have access to, they will still recognize that they have this abusive relationship and still think we get rid of that in our side of the house. But even then, I don't think either sides can claim that they can solve for abusive relationships. But secondly, on multiple perspectives in a minute, we have echo chambers in specific communities. Specific communities like in Texas is going to be different than specific communities in Canada. But still, we think we have variety of perspectives in this community. We don't specifically think we need interpersonal relationships, but rather we told you in our third substantive argument how we actually preserve culture, how we actually preserve perspectives. Because at the end of the day, we still have other outlets like schools. At the end of this day, we still have other outlets like church where we can have these differentiating perspectives. We can still have these differentiating beliefs. We never specifically told you how this is only unique to their side of the house. But before I go on, sure, I'll take your point.
Why is a church more supportive than a trusted neighbor?
Understand, I don't specifically think you have showed why this is only unique to a community. Here in debate, we act as a family, just like my debate members. At the end of the day, their parents don't take care of me, yet we feel a very close bond. You have never proved why the obligation of the community members is going to have better interpersonal relationships, is going to foster more community and foster different perspectives. I still understand the perspectives of my team members. However, their parents don't raise me. I don't have to have that ability just because we have like a parental obligation. But secondly, on the practicality of today's debate, we told you two main things. This was largely ignored by Team Proposition. First is the competition of affection and support. Let's give you a big view of what this actually looks like. Say in a prominently racist community, when you have like 90% of them is going to be racist, but you still have small minorities in this community, you're not going to have this beautiful like parental authority throughout these community members that Team Proposition tries to paint it. We're going to still see discrimination against minorities because at the end of the day, what we think is a primary care provider is going to have that obligation to better specifically cater to their own children. You lose that in their side of the house. Rather, you see these individuals prioritizing their favorites. They never gave us a sufficient response, so we still think we win on this clash. But secondly, we think this fosters complacency. Understand the conflicting viewpoints in their side of the house. When you have different figures of authority telling you, hey, this is right, what they told you was wrong, or don't specifically call out this issue, we think this is right, that fosters complacency within their own children because they don't have a primarily sense of influence from one caretaker. At the end of the day, when these children are when they're fostering complacency, when they can't call out these issues, we see a worse world in Team Proposition. Or their third substantive talks about isolation because they somehow think that block parties are more important than our side of the house when you actually have moral obligation, when you have a foundation of influence. A sense of community is not needed for interpersonal relationships. Rather, we still see that in our side of the house. We uniquely told you, even if you don't buy all our analysis, at the end of the day, we're the ones who preserve culture when we have a foundation of influence. We're the side that gives these children a better life, and we're the side that gives parents a choice to have these children and actually have them under their own wing, under their own influence, because at the end of the day, children are not objects. They're not something to pass around the community and say, wow, I did a great job. I helped this person with their homework. At the end of the day, we think primary care providers are better than just community support. So proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. If I can see the judges when they're ready. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. We are now moving to the end of the debate, and we will hear the closing speech from side opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Perfect. At the end of the day today, it's important for us to decide who are we caring about in today's debate, and that will decide how the ballot falls. First off, we believe the children are the most important stakeholder in today's debate. As we've shown you throughout our case, we believe in them and their future above all. Side proposition has decided to prioritize this sense of like community over a child's quality of life, learning, interpersonal relationships, and future stability. Let's go ahead and examine and weigh some arguments brought up today and tell you exactly why we win in protecting the child. First off, when we look at our very first substantives, they say that they have a parental obligation to give the child the best future possible. We agree here. The only problem is which side of the house actually does this. They tell you the neglect is becoming like super present in today's society. They also tell you that like helicopter parents are becoming more available to individuals, and that we tell you we're still seeing like intercultural connections or community connections here through like school, church, PTO, sports teams, all other things available to children outside of both school and outside of payment. You still make connections in your community. You still have children who go outside and are friends with their neighbors. The only thing they see uniquely on their side of the house is that community members are now morally obligated to babysit another's child, to help them with their homework, and to potentially get like home cooked meals in return. We tell you we can still see that type of like intercommunication in a community on our side of the house. It's not unique there. The only thing they get is that like now they've added a second moral obligation onto people who never asked for it in the first place. We tell you throughout our first substantive why a parent is morally obligated to the child, because they're the ones that raise them, they're the ones that chose them in some cases, and they're the ones who have a vested interest in making sure they're helpful. At the end of the day, the like existence of abuse is definitely a wash, but we still win that argument on our side of the house when we show you like better avenues with which to have these situations resolved. Again, it never goes addressed when I tell you in my second speech that this is going to look like children having their basic only option be to go to another parent's house or another parent's facility because they have such close interpersonal relationships in a community. They won't want to leave. Change becomes like a scary concept to them. We tell you on our side of the house that when the child has the ability to leave the community, they don't have to be presented to their abuser. They don't have to see them all the time. We see better situations for abused children on our side of the house when they're not reliant on an entire community for like all of their raising and helpful benefits. Then when it comes to the second substantive here, we show you practically why we see more benefits on our side of the house. Whether it looks like individuals being able to like live successfully, they're able to like make communications and connections without the fear of like change. We tell you that like individuals are able to preserve their culture in our third substantive because now the parent is there to pass down these beliefs. They tell you as a direct response to this that like, yes, all cultures are going to be celebrated. That's an issue there because you're taking away cultural identity and traditions that are like sacred or special to individuals and making them like a community fair. I like the fact that we have like cultural diversity and we allow individuals to live in a way that they can express their culture and continue to pass it down. We don't see that in community sides of the house. Side opposition wins on this point because we outweigh with like future diversity. They tell you they just want less polarized opinions. We win on the fact that we have better avenues to solve abuse, and we win on the fact that the child is more adapt to change and that the parent is the one there responsible for caring for them. They tell you that they just want a better society where we don't have to worry about daycare. We tell you those are not massive impacts in today's round, and in fact, most of those implications exist on our side of the house when you make friends in school. We do not think they have any unique benefits. Vote for side opposition. We care about both the child and their future.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We will now close out the debate with the conclusion of side proposition's case. Judges ready? Yes, yes, yes.
All right.
Okay.
When side opposition supports children using a toxic platform like social media as their main outlet as opposed to trusted adults and assume all communities are cults, say that diversity and multiculturalism is harmful, we think we already win this debate. Nevertheless, two themes we feel this debate best boiled down to. But before that, a couple really quick clarifications. We think we want to clarify that communities are not extremely close in the status quo. This is the problem we are trying to address from the beginning. We told you this in our framing, we told you this in our characterization. Down the bench, they failed to engage with its reality, they failed to engage with the real world. Second clarification. Basically, their stance says that grandparents are harmful. Our third speaker already told you about this. They never responded to this in their reply, never responded to this in their third speech. We think that they missed this. We think that it's not okay for them to not support authority figures that are not parents. Okay, so into the two themes then. Firstly, practical, secondly, principle. On the practical, what do they give you on their side? They basically give you this point about, well, basically the practical. They tell you that basically what's going to happen is that you're going to have a lot of stress, you're going to have competition, you're going to have these people that are like ultimately competing for attention. We don't think that this is actually true because they told you at the beginning of their second speech that we cannot compare these people to teachers. And then they told you that their mechanism for this is that it's like a classroom where you compete to be teacher's pet. So they literally just took down their own point while trying to take down our points. So basically, they took down their own point. But even without that, we think that they never actually explained why this exists, except for like the teacher analogy. We told you, and they told you, that it's different from teachers. These people are not teachers. They're like grandparents. They're like uncles. They're parents, but not quite parents. They are people who you feel close to, people you have a relationship with. On our side of the house, we told you that you have a parental obligation to create a safety net for your children, a parental obligation to ensure that if you can't take care of your kids, then someone else should be able to, because you can create these relationships with communal raising, right? They never responded to our point about poor parents, about how parents sometimes can't afford things, how parents sometimes need support. They never responded to that. They just said, oh, well, that's their problem. But we think that this is actually an extreme issue that can be solved on our side of the house, when other people can take care of these people, when other people can like care for these kids when the parents cannot. They also just tried to tell you that like children would care for themselves. They tell you that like they just tell you that like they have alternatives like daycare on their side of the house. But like we told you down the bench, this is different from daycare because this is an actual relationship, not just a teacher. This is a close connection that you form with these people. You actually create a safety net. You actually create something that they don't have on their side of the house when communities are not close together. So I think we went on this point when basically they took down their own point, and their point is basically based on an assumption that isn't true, based on a world that doesn't actually exist. Now on the principle, there's 2 points on both sides of the house here. What did they tell you? They tell you firstly about the principle. They tell you about how parents won't have autonomy, how this is not okay. As we told you in our model, again, parents will have some sort of autonomy. We just think it's beneficial to have a safety net. They never actually failed to engage with this down the bench. We think that we actually create more close relationships, create a safety net, create somewhere else for the people to go, a safe space for these kids if they so need it. And then they tell you about preservation of culture, and they tell you about like how multiculturalism is bad and how everybody's gonna like become the same person. This is not what diversity is. That's not what multiculturalism is. That is about celebrating the different cultures. It's about finding different experiences, finding different cultures, and saying, oh, look, that culture is cool, that culture is cool. You're not just gonna tell everyone like, oh, you guys should all be the same person. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to expose these kids to different viewpoints. We're trying to show them around the world, show them that not everyone is the same person, so that they can begin to become their own person instead of what their parents want them to be exactly as the same as their parents. On our side of the house, we give you 2 points. Firstly, what benefits to kids. Secondly, what benefits to communities. Under benefits to kids, basically, we told you that when you have these benefits, what you have is these kids are then able to be taken away from abusive parents. There are checks and balances. They just tell you that there's no checks and balances on our side of the house that don't exist on theirs. We think this is fundamentally untrue because when you create this relationship, people are more likely to go and call out the parents because they feel a sense of responsibility towards the kid because they started to raise them. Secondly, about benefits to communities, I told you how like basically what you're going to have is we told you how communities are then going to be more closely knit. Told you how we solved the issue of isolation. They basically told you people will be scared to leave then, and we don't understand how this is true because one, they just conceded that there will be relationships because they said people will be scared to leave because of these relationships, and secondly, they told you that and then basically, but they won't get scared because just a relationship. So proud.
Thank you very much. All right, so there's a little bit of a time-intensive process here. We're going to leave, each judge decides independently. They have to send their decision and reasons to me. Then I have to read those and compile them, send them to the Tabmeister, and then get back to you. So we'll be a few minutes. At this point, I'm turning off the recording.